Bill Shorten has announced his retirement from politics. He will leave Parliament and will become the next Vice Chancellor of the University of Canberra, starting in 2025. This brings to an end a very long, albeit slightly mixed career as a politician, marked by perhaps a very long track record, but also some rather large failings. Bill Shorten, after all, is probably best known for two things, neither of which went particularly well. The first, of course, is the NDIS, which, while well-intentioned, has ballooned and become financially unsustainable. The second is losing the unloseable election. So let's start with the NDIS. Bill Shorten was heavily involved in the creation of the NDIS, pushing hard for it during the Rudd-Gillard years. He has been the Minister for the NDIS since 2022, when Anthony Albanese came back into office. However, despite its noble initial intentions, the NDIS is, and always was, unsustainable. It has grown by some 20% per year in cost in recent years. It blew up by $5.4 billion over the past year. It costs around $42 billion per year currently, and is projected to grow to $125 billion by 2034. Growing at 20% per year is simply unsustainable. It can't grow faster than GDP growth and be affordable. It simply cannot be financed and cannot be afforded. Bill Shorten, of course, has tried, since his coming in 2022, to renegotiate the NDIS and to bring about some changes through negotiation with the states. The underlying problem, however, is that this takes the states buying into these negotiations, which they're reticent to do because this would mean they're getting less money from the federal government. And it appears to be too little, too late. After all, the legislation already exists, already came in, and now he needs to wrangle concessions from the states to make any changes. There is a clear lesson from this that already should have been learned. You always have to address downside risks and concerns when passing legislation. You need to make sure that legislation can't simply open itself up to mission creep, can't open itself up to increasingly expensive shenanigans. This was obvious at the time, and it is still obvious, but it is a lesson that the federal government keeps refusing to learn. For example, during the Voice referendum campaign, those concerns were dismissed as fear-mongering. Australians, of course, saw through that rhetoric, and the Voice referendum ultimately failed. However, federal government seems to like to ignore downside risks in service of getting a sugar hit from passing some piece of legislation, even if there are long-term negatives associated with it. The NDIS legislation shows precisely why those downside risks have to be considered and why the legislation needs to be watertight. Now, there's no shortage of bad use cases in the NDIS, for example. Take this example as reported by the ABC. Quote, as a young man, cut off from touch and intimacy, William said he was, quote, in absolute despair. And his isolation led to times of feeling like self-ending and an admission to a psychiatric hospital. Now, he's a professional with a mortgage and everything else that most people would expect living a life. He also engages in, let's call them ladies of the night, using funding provided by the NDIS, seemingly to rectify concerns that he might have about his well-being. Now, the issue here and the operative problem here is the NDIS is funding particular types of workers and particular types of services being provided to individuals, something that even Bill Shorten said does not pass muster. Now, Bill Shorten, therefore, has sought to rein in such excesses. However, it is too little too late. You shouldn't need to be doing this after the fact. This should never have been allowed into legislation, because if you need to do a cleanup after the fact, then you need to negotiate for that and it becomes inherently costly. The NDIS also remains unsustainable and is growing faster than GDP, which means it simply cannot be afforded without dramatically increasing taxes. And this is only going to get worse as demands on the NDIS become greater and greater over time. The second thing Bill Shorten is known for, at least to my mind, is losing the unloseable 2019 election. This election was so unlosable that betting agencies had actually paid out on him winning before election day. Think on that. The betting agencies were so confident that Bill Shorten would win that they paid out before the verdict and the vote even came in or was even conducted. However, the betting agencies then lost big time when Scott Morrison won. There are different hypotheses for why Scott Morrison won. My hypothesis is that Labour ran a divisive campaign, and it was so hollow and divisive and anti-aspirational that people simply turned on it. And people became extremely tired of being castigated every time they raised objections. Now, Labour's campaign at that point was especially targeting property owners, but of course they had a whole swathe of policies. But I recall that anytime people raised concerns back then, people were accused of being homophobic or racist or sexist because they weren't just falling in line behind the ALP. And this in large part was because the Liberal Party back then was not particularly popular in the wake of the same-sex marriage debate. That is, it was seen that if you didn't go all in behind Labour, then you must be some form of homophobe, and that's the rhetoric and the line that was being run. However, much like we saw during the Voice referendum campaign, people don't like being called racist or sexist or homophobic and then forced to fall into line. Rather, people like being able to make up their own mind, and people perhaps saw through the rhetoric that Labour was wheeling out back then. Now, of course, back then, interest rates were also relatively low. So when Labour was attacking property owners and were trying to get rid of things like so-called negative gearing, then the financial pain might have been contained, and it might have been somewhat possible to do back then if Labour had not won such a ham-fisted campaign. However, of course, that is now nigh impossible, given that interest rates have shifted structurally higher. Now, Labour's campaign at the time was to demonise property owners, demonise people who become wealthy, demonise people who worked hard, and demonise ambition. I.e., their campaign was anti-aspirational and anti-ambition, and effectively anti-going out and working hard in order to earn more money. It was textbook divisive socialist demagoguery, and it ultimately didn't work. This, of course, was a little bit unusual, because often, when your policies are to rob Peter to pay Paul, you can usually count on the vote of Paul. Therefore, it is amazing that Bill Shorten's politicking was so hollow and so anti-aspirational that he lost so spectacularly. Now, Bill Shorten, of course, has now left Parliament, never having fulfilled the promise of becoming the next Prime Minister of Australia. And there's politicking over who shall replace Bill Shorten in his seat in Victoria. It's been hypothesised that it's likely to go to someone from Labour's left. However, of course, it remains to be seen. Now, Bill Shorten himself is set to become the Vice Chancellor of the University of Canberra. He's set to earn more than $1 million per year. He'll earn more than the Prime Minister. He presumably was also chosen for his Labour bona fides. Now, of course, when he's the University Vice Chancellor, I assume he will still try to instill Labour politics throughout the university. There probably won't be too much of a change or too much of a challenge, given that universities seem to inherently support Labour and the Greens anyway. However, of course, interestingly, he might actually be more right-wing than the university sector in general, which to my mind is a little bit boggling. Now, of course, the irony is that Bill Shorten is going to earn more than $1 million per year. I'll be curious to see whether he keeps up his anti-aspirational rhetoric when he is earning more than most Australians ever will. However, I would not be keeping my hopes up. But in any case, for Bill Shorten, he has now left politics and entered the university sector. I do wonder how many people are going to miss his presence in Parliament. Let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below.